Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Yuracek.
Welcome to another Toronto Rehab Week 2019 Spotlight interview presented by IFAS, the International Functional Electrical Stimulation Society. Thanks to them for sponsoring these episodes. So in this episode, we'll be talking to Dimitry Sayenko and Christina Salchow-Hommen, who both presented during the IFS program session on neural circuits. Christina Salchow-Hommen is from Charité Universitätsmedizin in Berlin, Germany, and she had a presentation called Characterization of Optimal Electrode Configurations for Transcutaneous Spinal Cord Stimulation. The talk presented her findings from a small trial, and this included 5 participants living with spinal cord injuries. In the trial, they were trying to find the optimal placements and size of surface stimulation electrodes to elicit a response on the rectus femoris and the tibialis anterior muscles. The study found variability in electrode placement, but some commonalities at the T11 level spinal circuit level. Let's catch up with her in her interview.
Christina, can you just introduce yourself and tell us what institution you're with?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Christina Salchow-Hommen. I'm a biomedical engineer from Berlin, Germany, and there I work at a university hospital called Charité, but I closely collaborate with my former institution, the Technical University of Berlin, because I also have a technical background, and my focus is on the re-establishment of motor abilities through new rehabilitation technologies.
So speaking of neuromodulation technologies, what you presented today was really focusing on surface stimulation for transcutaneous spinal cord stimulation for rehabilitation. And you really talked about the placement. So could you go just really quickly in your talk about where you found some similarities across all 5 subjects?
Yeah, actually, when you take a look at the positions, you see that we placed an array along the spine, and most of the positions were sort of in the middle of this array, which is kind of good because when you are on the outer edge, then you would think that maybe you should have bigger array and see if it would be on the area is not covering the area. So that's basically what we've seen. And then I think there's a lot of difference in the positions also, and also what the subjects reported on how they experience the stimulation.
And did you play with different types of parameters from subject to subject? Because it sounds like that type of stimulation needs to be very individualized.
Yeah, so here we really just did this double pulse stimuli and with the intensities, but actually not in all patients we were subjects. It was healthy
volunteers, participants.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but I also work with patients, so it's all confusing. Not all of them tolerated it, that we go up to 60 milliampere on the back. So I think if they would put their teeth together and they would have gone through it, but we didn't think that was so important to us. If we've seen already that there were some responses, so why go even higher if we already got what we needed? And actually in clinical practice, we now try different stimulation frequencies and see also and we do a questionnaire about how they experience the stimulation. So there, maybe we will soon have some insights on what people prefer.
Exactly. That's great. So one last question for you. We're here at IFS, that's also coupled with Rehab Week. And one of the things that we're trying to always understand when it comes to electrical stimulation is what are we missing in terms of our understanding of the mechanisms of action? Where do you think that we need to go next when we look at this type of stimulation?
I think, and that's what we are trying at our lab currently, is like we really need to apply stimulation and measure in the brain during the stimulation, and we need to find new assessments to better monitor the effects, for example, because I also experienced that not only the stimulation position is individual, but also the benefits are very individual, and it's kind of difficult. Like if the patients told you afterwards, well, I felt so much better the whole day, and they do not do that when they have a sham stimulation. So you know it's not a placebo effect purely. Then you have to think of, okay, but how can we measure this? And this would also give us more insights about the mechanisms, I would think.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you for being with us, Christina.
Now, Dimitry Sayenko works at the Center for Neurogeneration at Houston Methodist Research Institute, and he gave a talk about neuromodulation of spinal networks to recover motor function, underlying mechanisms, and clinical translations. He talked about the differences in the epidural spinal stimulation clinical trials, which are being conducted at University of Louisville, UCLA, and EPFL in Geneva, Switzerland. There were differences among labs, but he found that the key is enabling versus inducing movement with stimulation, and he argued that the intense exercise regimes from some of these studies is not necessary. Let's listen in on the interview.
Dimitry, great to hear from you today. Can you just introduce yourself and let us know what institution you're from?
Hi, I'm Dimitry Sayenko, and I work at Houston Methodist Research Institute.
Well, thanks for being here. You had a really exciting talk. You really wanted to focus in on the mechanisms of action when we're looking at spinal cord stimulation, particularly for the restoration of function. And when you introduced this, can you kind of give us some of your thoughts about how the brain is learning the activity that's related to the spine?
It's a very interesting question, and the idea is that after spinal cord injury, the connection between the brain and spinal cord has separated. So there is no more connection. And as such, spinal cord and brain, they are not communicating with each other. But it's quite a dogmatic and traditional view. In fact, after spinal cord injury, it has been shown that in more than 80%, there are some residual connections between the brain and spinal cord, although they are not functional, they are subfunctional. So using spinal stimulation, we can promote these connections and make brain and the spinal cord communicate again. So this is the whole premise of this approach, and it's been shown that at least we can objectively measure the descending control from the brain, and we yet to have to prove that there is ascending control as well.
So there's a new kind of theory out there when it comes to spinal cord stimulation for pain, in terms of the brain kind of learning what pain is, right? And once you put on the stimulation, it starts to learn again that there is no pain. So it's almost like this plasticity in the brain in terms of the stimulation that it's getting from a pain perspective. But I'm wondering about, do you think this might be able to bleed over when you're looking at functional restoration in the motor cortex? Maybe the brain is starting to learn to move again. I don't know if that's something that you've explored or will explore in the future.
Absolutely. And it's been shown for a while that after the spinal cord injury, or many neurological disorders actually, the sensory motor cortex undergoing a remapping. So basically the brain loses the idea which area is controlling what. So, and we saw it a lot when we first applied our stimulation and asked people with spinal cord injury to move. So they really, first several minutes at least, they have to figure out what they have to do. What is the sense of flexion now against of extension, or what particular muscles they have to contract. They have to play a bit about it. Ideally, they would have to have a feedback about it. And definitely, there are indications that with the training, we can retune, remap the sensory motor projections again, back to how they were functioning before, or maybe build up new connections, new map, which would be effective to perform a particular movement.
So, Dimitry, you mentioned that in your presentation. You talked about you had a participant that only had 12 sessions of training to be able to get to a standing point. Do you think that training period can be reduced quite significantly? Because that's been a real hurdle when it comes to spinal cord stimulation and the restoration of function.
Well, I also mentioned that, for instance, to get the function to kind of bring up a new level of performance, we probably do not need more sessions. So totally the effects of spinal neuromodulation would be seen and can be seen within first, second sessions. But it's just not enough. It's just a starting point. So I think about it this way, that we just bring a new starting point for a person to go through intensive therapy.
So it's almost following the same theory that we've used for neuromuscular electrical stimulation, or FES, for a period of time, is that it's not an immediate effect. You might see some immediate results, but you really have to use it over a period of time to see a real kind of a cumulative effect. Is that what you're saying?
Right. So it's basically, and again, you can look at it from the point of regular exercise. So if we want to learn certain skill, we have to repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. And of course, some people can regain certain, or not regain, learn some skill within a few training sessions, but the more you train, the better the skill. So the same is for rehab.
Going back to involving the brain, one of the things that we've learned in terms of stimulation of the brain is that the timing is very important. So we've found this, and they're looking at memory restoration for stimulation of the brain. When they time the stimulation is extremely important of how the brain responds for memory. I'm wondering, have you started to explore, do you think that might be an impact in terms of stimulating the spinal cord for some functional restoration in terms of this timing of that stimulation?
You mean following the injury, right?
Mm-hmm.
I totally believe that it's critical when we start stimulation. It's just we are trying to still validate the method. We are still trying to prove that spinal stimulation is that much effective, for instance, right? So that's why we a bit of hostages, of this kind of way of research or presenting our data. So we have to prove that there was no spontaneous recovery after the injury, that our people have chronic spinal cord injury. So then we submit our studies to papers, to journals, to NIH, and we have to make them believe that there was no recovery after the injury, and then when we apply this neuromodulation, then we regain certain.
So, but focusing in on, if you're looking at gait, when are you going to apply that actual stimulation? So is it in which phase of the gait, which, because there's 16 electrodes in that pad, which electrode you're going to stimulate at the same time? Have you started to look at that timing effect?
I see. Well, Dr. Gregor Curtin proved that this is important. In our approaches, we didn't see that this timing and stimulation of particular motor pool is mission critical in this case. So we believe that by providing relatively non-specific pattern of stimulation would be sufficiently effective to promote motor function and enable motor function, including stepping as well.
So in that same theory, are you looking at how to choose or specify the parameters of your stimulation and using some machine learning, almost trying to put in a closed loop? Or, we're still dealing with open loop systems, but is there a way to learn the patterns of that individual to help map those parameters? Machine
learning probably would be ideal. I don't think that we are there yet. I think that it is, again, it's yet to be applied and explored. But this is probably the future of this method. And we know that it is effective. It's just now we probably have to look into the possibility to complement it with either machine learning, for instance, more specific patterns of stimulation, stimulation along different pathways of the spinal cord, complemented with pharmacology, for instance. So this is all probably in a bit in the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. One last question. So we're here at IFES. It's part of Rehab Week. What's some of the most exciting things that are motivating you this week?
Well, for me, probably, and this is always subjective, personal, is just, again, I was here for 4 years, and I came here as a postdoctoral fellow in 2008, and I had great training, I think, which brought me where I am now. And to me, it's just lots of memories and thrills to see this again, to see the people whom I worked with, whom I was studied from.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it. Have a great time the rest of the week.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.